Hello everyone, this is Savannah Bekowski, Project Assistant at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Pricing Water for Full Cost Recovery, How Different Rate Structures Impact Different Customers. To give you an idea of where others on the webinar are tuning in from, we have prepared this map. You can see that we have attendees spread all throughout the country. Thanks to you all for joining us today. This session is one of several webinars conducted by the Environmental Finance Center Network for the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. The EFCN provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all 50 states and 5 territories to help local water systems achieve and maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that we have centers spread all across the country. And here you can see the various areas of expertise that the EFCN focuses on. Workshops, trainings, and direct technical assistance are provided on all of the following topics listed below. The EFCN also provides a small systems blog. You can learn more about water finance and management through this blog. Blog posts feature lessons learned from our trainings and technical assistance, descriptions of available tools, and small system success stories. You will have an opportunity to subscribe to this blog at the end of the webinar. In addition to workshops, direct technical assistance, and webinars, as part of the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project, we have also created a table that lists the major funding sources for drinking water infrastructure projects in each state and territory. Here's how you can access those tables. From the EFCN homepage, go to the Resources tab, and then click on Funding Sources by State. This will take you to a map of the country. If you click on the state you're interested in, you will find a PDF table of the relevant funding sources for drinking water infrastructure in that state. The table will look like the image on the left-hand side of the slide. For each funding program, it includes the name of the program, a short description, and contact information for someone who works in the program. And at this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to our presenter. Our presenter today is Glenn Barnes, Associate Director of the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Glenn, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Savannah, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Very excited to be with you and delighted to be talking to you about how to price water to achieve full cost recovery and how different types of pricing models impact different types of customers. So our objectives are, first off, to think about how to calculate both the base charge and the volumetric charge to cover the full cost of providing water service. And then we're going to demonstrate the impact of different pricing structures on different customers. I've got an example I'll show you from a real-life water system. And then very briefly at the end, I want to discuss some of the factors that could impact your pricing assumption. So we're going to make some guesses as we set our rates and what might make those guesses prove to be not true in the long term. So what I want to start off with this idea is that rate structures are really the primary way that we as water systems, quote unquote, communicate with our customers. So most of the ways that we send messages to customers about their behavior is going to come through the rate structure itself, and then in some cases, quite literally, the bill is the primary way that we're communicating with customers. And here's a question that we hear often. As Savannah mentioned, we do a lot of technical assistance with this project and in our other work. And a lot of times, attendees of webinars or workshops will ask us, question, are our rates right? Seems like a pretty reasonable question, and I think our initial answer to them is probably a little bit disappointing because our answer is, it depends. And part of the reason that it depends is that it really depends on what it is that you are trying to do with your rate structure. So that's where we're going to start the webinar, is to talk about some of the objectives that you as a water system may have. So for example, that could include full cost recovery or revenue stability. This is going to be the primary objective we'll talk about on today's webinar, but it's basically ensuring that you have all the money you need to run your water system today and into the future. You may have an objective of encouraging conservation, so needing your customers to actually cut back on usage. Maybe you're in a drought-prone area, or maybe you're in a part of the country that is growing with scarce water resources, or maybe this is just an environmental value for your community. So that's another objective. Fostering business-friendly practices is an objective through your rates. So if you want to attract large using water customers, are your rates set up in a way to do that? And then finally, a lot of us care a great deal about maintaining affordability. So water is a public service in addition to being an enterprise fund. And while we want to be a well-run business, we want to make sure that all customers in our community can afford at least a lifeline amount of water. So when we're asked that question, are our rates right? This is generally where we start the conversation is, what is important to you as a water system? And depending on what your answer is, that's going to depend on then how we can answer the question of whether or not your rates are right. But as I said, we're really focusing today on this top left box, which is full cost recovery and revenue stability. So this is going to be your ability through rates and fees to bring in enough revenue to cover the full cost of running your water system. That's going to be your operations and maintenance costs. It's going to be your capital needs today and into the future, and it's going to be your debt service payments. You know, and why do this? Why is this important? Well, because we want to have well-run water systems today and into the future. And we know from doing a lot of work with water systems and looking at their financials that full cost recovery and revenue stability is not always something that water systems achieve. They often bring in enough to cover, say, their operation and maintenance costs. If they have debt service, maybe enough for that, but not always enough for those future capital needs. And so when we're thinking about pricing water, we want to price it in a way that allows us to have the money we need today and into the future to make sure that our infrastructure continues to function properly to provide safe water to our customers. Okay, so I'm going to get Savannah to launch a couple of polling questions for us at this point. Savannah, can you go ahead and launch the first one, please?
You got it. And the first polling question is full cost recovery or revenue stability important to your water system? And please select from one of the following answers. And we'll leave this poll open for about another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. Glenn, 97% of our attendees have agreed that full cost recovery and revenue stability is important.
All right, well that's a lot of you, so that's great. Okay, now let's ask another question.
And the second polling question is, which of these water system objectives is most important to your system? And please select from one of the following: full cost recovery or revenue stability, promoting conservation, fostering business-friendly practices, maintaining affordability, or something else. And we'll leave this poll open for about another 10 seconds since this one takes a little bit more thought. And we'll get ready to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The majority of our attendees at 70% have picked full cost recovery and revenue stability.
All right, well that's good to know, and thankfully that's what we'll be spending the rest of the day talking about. So, you know, we're definitely into this idea of full cost pricing. This is important to most of you. It's the most important to many of you of the list provided there. So the goal of this, as I said, is that what you charge your customers for water will cover the entire cost of running that water system both today and into the future. But of course, there's a lot of different ways we can do this to come up to the same dollar figure, and that's what we're going to focus on in today's session. And a lot of it comes down to your rate setting philosophy. You know, what are you trying to achieve with your rates, and who should pay, who should benefit from the rate structures that you have? So, for example, you may think that, you know, you're in favor of payment for access. That's your philosophy, that everybody should pay just to access the system that is there. You may say, no, you know, I think we should pay strictly for the volume of the product received. So it should all be based on usage, not based on access. You might say, well, we have a lot of fixed charges that don't really vary depending on how much water people consume. So that should be covered in a fixed charge. And then we have charges that do vary, things like chemicals and power and purchasing of water that do vary based on the amount of water that we treat and sell, so that should be covered variably. Or you might think some mix of the above, and we're going to go through an example that looks at all of these. But I think really there's not a single right answer to what the rate structure should be, even based on your rate setting objectives. And that's why when my colleague Jeff Hughes wrote an article some years back about rate setting, he did not call it the science of setting water rates. He called it the painful art of setting water and sewer rates, because that's really what it is. We're going to have to make some decisions and go through a lot of messiness to come up with what we feel like is a good and fair rate structure. All right, so what I'd like to do now is figure out some rates for an example water system that cover the full cost of providing water service. So many of you have said that's your number one priority. Let's take a look at a couple of different ways for a single water system we can achieve this particular goal. And the water system that we're going to look at is Irvindale, USA. I have made up the name of this town, but it is what we're actually going to look at are actual numbers and actual budgets from a small water system that we've worked with here in the U.S. But let me tell you a little bit about Irvindale in general. It's a small town that has both a water and wastewater system, has a population of about 1,100 people. It has 450 service connections and a median household income of a little under $25,000. Which is below state and national averages. So for many of you, this may sound a lot like your town, a small town, not very high income, that is running its own water and in this case as well a wastewater system. So we want to think about how much money are we going to bring in for this utility, for this water system through the water rates versus other charges. And I should take a step back and say, especially for those of you who are from local government systems, you know, water and wastewater are meant to be enterprise funds. So we're going to go with the assumption here that there is no tax revenue going into this. If you're a homeowner association, we're going to go with the assumption that you have a water charge that's separate from the general HOA fee, and none of the general HOA fee is going into this. We're going to assume, for the sake of this utility, that it is a proper enterprise fund that is completely self-supporting. The shot on the screen right now is the actual budget from this water system, and it needs to raise in revenues $382,000 and change. And as you'll see that I have a number there highlighted, a line highlighted there in yellow, which is water and sewer charges, which is about $344,000. So the difference of these, the other $40,000 in total revenue are coming from connection fees, penalties, I think there was a grant in there, so other sources. But for the sake of this exercise, our target number is $344,445. That is how much money this water system needs to raise through its rates. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of different rate structures that are going to get us to this same number, $344,445. Once we do that, we'll take kind of pivot a little bit and say, all right, how would each of those different rate structures impact different types of customers living within Irvindale? Okay, so where we're going to start is payment for access. So in its purest form, everybody in the water system pays the same amount for access to the system, regardless of how much water they use. So we're going to base the entirety of the charge on the fact that people are going to pay for water that is just available to them, regardless of quantity. And this is an example of a community that has this type of rate structure, Jacksonville, Georgia. We do a statewide rate survey in some states, and they faxed us back a note just saying we charge a flat rate of $15 monthly. We're a small town. We do not have sewage. This is their rate structure, and at $15 a month, it covers, per customer, it covers the full cost of providing water service. So this is an example of payment for access. So what information would we need to calculate this? The first thing that we're going to need is the total revenue needed from rates, that $344,445 that we mentioned earlier. And then we will also need to know the total number of accounts for this water system. So if you wanted to replicate this process in your system, these are the two bits of information we would need. So for Irvindale, we know the total revenue needed, $344,445, and then their total number of accounts are 450. So we got that from the information from the water utility. You do the math there, and it comes out to an annual bill per connection of $765.43. And since we'll look at this from a monthly basis, we divide that by 12. And so the monthly bill is $63.79. And if everybody, all 450 accounts in Irvindale pay $63.79 per month, and the expenses are as budgeted, at the end of the year, Irvindale will have collected exactly $344,445. So in terms of rate setting objectives, this is covering full cost recovery, the top left bucket for sure, because every example we look at will do that. This is probably not a good rate structure for encouraging conservation because people are not paying based on the volume of water they're using. It's not pretty good for affordability, as we'll see a little bit later in some of our examples, because everybody pays the same regardless of usage. But it could be considered business friendly because, in fact, if you're a higher using water customer, this would probably give you a much lower bill than you would have otherwise. All right, so this is option one, all base charge, no volumetric charge, payment for access. Let's look at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, payment for the volume of product received. So in its purest form, everyone in the water system pays for the volume of water received and only for the volume of water received. So there are no base charges. It's going to be all on volumetric. So in order to do this, here's an example, from Troutman, North Carolina, small town, that they charge $7.72 per 1,000 gallons for water. If you're an in-town customer, if you're out of town, it's double that, $15.44 per 1,000 gallons. Troutman does not have a base charge, so they are completely volumetric in terms of their rate structure. And again, we see a lot of examples of this from around the country. So the information that we need here to make this calculation is, number one, the total revenue needed from rates, $344,445. And then we'll also need to know the total number of gallons sold. So not the total number of gallons produced, because there may be non-revenue water, water loss, people who are authorized to use water, flushing of hydrants, etc. We actually need to know what are people being billed across Irvindale. So let's take a look at the math for this. So $344,445 again is the total needed revenue. And the total gallons sold, which we got from Irvindale, was about 32.8 million gallons sold annually. So we'll divide that out. That'll give us a price per gallon. And so to get the price per 1,000 gallons, we multiply that number by 1,000, and it comes out to a price of $10.48 per 1,000 gallons. So the initial rate structure was about $64, flat fee for unlimited water use with no volumetric charge. This option is no base charge, but all volumetric charge. It would be $10.48 per 1,000 gallons. And as long as Irvindale in this year sells 32.87 million gallons, it will come up with exactly the right amount of money that it needs at the end of the year. Okay, so again, which of the objectives we talked about earlier would this type of rate structure help with? Well, again, full cost recovery is definitely there because it'll get us the right amount of money. And this could be a way to encourage conservation. If people have to pay for every single gallon of water that they consume, they may be more likely to cut back on their water use, so it could be good for encouraging conservation. It might be a good way to maintain affordability because customers have a lot of control over their bill. You know, if you're a small using customer and you don't want to pay a big bill, you can cut back somewhat on your usage and be able to control that cost. But if you're a large using business and you have to pay for every gallon of water consumed, you're going to see a pretty high bill under this type of rate structure. So it doesn't quite work as well for the fostering business practices if that's one of your main objectives. All right, so those are the two extreme ends. You know, payment for access, payment for product received. let's take a look at a couple that fall in the middle of these two. And so one is that, we have a base charge that we charge customers for being tied into the system, and then we have a volumetric charge based on their usage. What we could say is the base charge should cover 100% of the fixed costs of a water system, and the volumetric charge should cover 100% of the variable costs. And let me explain a little bit what I mean here by fixed and variable. Fixed costs do not change based on the amount of water that we treat and sell in a given year. So what you pay personnel, what you pay in insurance, what you pay your accountant every year, what you pay for testing costs, generally speaking, these costs are not dependent at all on how much water you treat and sell. The variable costs, however, are dependent on how much you treat and sell, and that would include things like your electricity, your chemicals that you use for treatment, and if you're a system that purchases water from a wholesaler and then resells water to your customers, obviously there's going to be, that charge will depend on how much water is consumed. So typically for water systems, in particular small water systems, the fixed costs here, which would, by the way, also include your debt service or capital outlays, are going to be the vast majority of your overall annual expenses. And the variable costs will probably be a much smaller number unless you are a water system that only purchases water, or maybe if you're a water system that has a volunteer staff. So generally speaking, these fixed costs are going to be a lot more than variable costs, but that's not always the way that we set up rate structures. So we said, all right, let's see if we can find an example that essentially has the base charge every month covering the fixed cost and the volumetric charge covering the variable costs. We couldn't find one exactly there, but one that got us pretty close was Reedsboro, Vermont. So Reedsboro, Vermont has a base charge of $38 every month that includes the first 4,000 gallons of usage. And then above 4,000 gallons of usage, they charge a rate of $9.50 per 1,000 gallons. So we did some analysis for Reedsboro of their water finances, and what we found is on the revenue side, about 76% of the revenue they bring in every year comes from the base charge, 24% comes from the variable charge, the per gallon charge. If you look at the expenses, 91% of the expenses were fixed and 9% were variable, but this is much closer in terms of a revenue and expense split, fixed versus variable, than we typically see with a water system. So just an example to put out there for you. All right, so for Irvindale, if we wanted to figure this out, there is some information we're going to need. First, we're going to need the total revenue needed to cover fixed costs, the total number of accounts, the total revenue we need to cover variable costs, and then the total gallons sold. So we dug through the finances and budgets for Irvindale and figured out that of that $344,445, $52,000 of that was a variable cost in that given year. So that was for water and sewer utilities, for chemicals, and for water purchases. Everything else equated to $292,000 and change. So the $292,000 we're going to generate here from the base charge. The $52,000 and change we're going to generate from the volumetric charge. All right, so how do we do that? The fixed annual cost, $292,045, we're going to divide by the total number of accounts, which is 450. And then that's going to give us a total annual bill to cover those fixed costs of $648.99 per connection. Divide that by 12, and that gives us a base bill of $54.08 per month per account. Then on the variable side, the total variable annual costs are $52,000. Again, the total gallons sold are 32.8 million. And so we do the math there, divide that, multiply it by 1,000, so we get a price per 1,000 gallons, and it comes out to $1.59. So Irvindale has an option that, again, will give them full cost recovery, that they could charge every one of their accounts $54 a month, and then they could charge $1.59 per 1,000 gallons. And at the end of the year, they should have the right amount of money, assuming that customers continue to use the same volume of water. And the nice thing here is, let's say in Irvindale there's a drought and customers are forced to cut back on their water use. They will still be able to cover the fixed cost, the $292,000 of running that water system that won't change because of that. Say there's mandatory water use restrictions. They're going to be able to cover that through the base bill, and whatever money they lose through the volumetric charge should be reflected in a reduction of cost because they'd be using less power and less chemicals because they'd be selling less water. So again, this gets us full cost recovery. It is not really great at encouraging conservation because, again, the base charge is very high and the volumetric charge is very low. In terms of affordability, it's probably not so great either because, again, of that very, very high base charge. We'll see in a few minutes when we look at some examples of a low-use customer is not going to pay substantially different bill from a high-use customer, so it's probably not great at maintaining affordability. But again, on the business-friendly practices side, that really low volumetric charge might be very attractive to a high-use water customer. All right, so let's look at one last example that, again, kind of falls in that middle spectrum. We're going to say $25 is the base charge, and everything else we need will come from the volumetric rates. Denton, North Carolina, a water system that we have done some work with, they charge $25 a month. That includes 1,000 gallons of water, and then all of their usage above that is $6.15. So they're just an example of a water system that happens to have a $25 base charge. All right, so to do this math, it's a little more complicated than the other ones. We're going to need the total number of accounts, the total revenue needed, and the total gallons. So that's all information we've already looked at. And the way to do it is you need to start with 12 months times the $25 base charge times the total number of accounts, which is 450. And that's going to give us $135,000 every year that Irvindale will raise from that $25 base charge. All right, we know they need $344,445. So we subtract $135,000 from that. That gives us a balance of $209,445. That's what we need to generate from the volumetric charge, so the per 1,000 gallon charge. So we'll carry that number down to the bottom of the screen here, 209,445. Divide that by the 32.8 million gallons sold in the year, multiply it by 1,000, and we'll come out with a price per 1,000 gallons of $6.37. So in this case, customers would have a base bill every month of $25, and then they would pay $6.37 per 1,000 gallons. So these are the four options that we have generated. A base charge of $63.79 only, a volumetric charge of $10.48 per 1,000 gallons only. So number one is all base charge. Number two is all volumetric charge. Number three, a base charge of $54.08 per month, and the volumetric charge of $1.59 per 1,000 gallons. And then option four, a base charge of $25 per month, and a volumetric charge of $6.37 per 1,000 gallons. All four of these rate structures, as long as our assumptions about the number of customers and gallons used are constant, they will all give us $344,445 at the end of the day. But as you can see, they're very, very different. So we have a polling question for you to consider with these four rate structures that I'll get Savannah to launch for us now.
You got it. So again, if you could please answer the following poll question. Which of the following looks the most like a rate structure? A base rate of $63.79, a volumetric charge of $10.48, a base charge of $54.08 with a volumetric charge of $1.59, or the last option, a base charge of $25 with a volumetric charge of $6.37. And we'll leave this poll open for about another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. So Glenn, the majority of our attendees have picked the last option, a base charge of $25 with a volumetric charge of $6.37.
Excellent. I was really hoping that that was the one that came up as the top answer in that poll question, and let me tell you why. You might be sitting there wondering, where did $25 come from? The other three, there's obvious places of where these numbers come from. And if we were all sitting in a classroom right now, or if I could unmute you, I'd love to hear your thoughts as to where $25 come from, but I'll give you the answer. I was sitting on my bed the other night and thought $25 sounds like a good base charge. It has nothing to do with anything other than it sounded like a good number. And I think that that number, 25 and 6 something per thousand gallons, looks like, we do rate surveys in 14 states. That looks like the majority of the rate structures that we see. And interestingly, it's the one that has nothing to do with the numbers that we've calculated, but that may be okay, because what we're basically saying there is that we're going to say some of the fixed charges of the water system, this is the rate setting philosophy that that rate would have. Some of the fixed charges of the water system should be covered by the base bill, but some of them should be covered by the volumetric. So if you are a very low user, you're going to pay a little bit less for those fixed charges than somebody who's a higher user, but you're still going to pay more than just based on the volume. So that is, a philosophy that you may have. And so I don't want to, downplay the idea if I just made up this number, but the truth is I did just make up the number. It doesn't have anything to do with anything in the rates and in the budget. But it does appear to be the most comfortable, the most similar to us when we think about water rate structures. All right, so this is all well and good. We have 4 very different options, and obviously we could keep going. We could have 100 or 200 or 300 or 1,000 different options that all get us to 344, 445. But what I want to stop now and do, rather than spending the next half an hour going through many more examples, is there's a second step of this. You have to ask, so what? What is the impact of that particular rate structure on your customer base? Because you know your customer base better than anybody, right? So we wanted to take a look at how these different rate structures impact different types of customers that exist within the town of Irvindale, our example community. So these are the 4 customers we're going to look at. The first is an elderly person on a fixed income who uses 1,000 gallons of water per month. So that's the first customer that we're going to look at. The second customer is an average household. So this is, typical household within the community. It uses 4,000 gallons a month, which is about the average usage as we understand it in the state that Irvindale is located. So what is their bill going to look like? The third is, a bigger house that has a lot of yard irrigation, maybe a swimming pool or a hot tub or a fountain or something like that. So they're using 12,000 gallons a month. They probably have some quite a bit of discretionary water use. And then the fourth is a cafe on Main Street that, just a small town Main Street restaurant that uses 34,000 gallons a month. So we're going to take a look at these 4 customers, and we're going to think about how much would each of these customers pay under those 4 rate structures, and how does that play into our level of comfort in terms of billing. All right, so let's talk about payment for access. This one is the easiest to calculate because there's nothing to calculate. If you remember, in payment for access, every customer, regardless of usage, pays exactly the same amount per month. So all of them would pay $63.79. So that's the easy one to do. All right, for the payment of the volume of product received. In this case, we're going to have to take their respective usage, 1,000 gallons, 4,000 gallons, 12,000 gallons, and 34,000 gallons, and multiply it by that water rate, which, if you recall, was about $10 and change per 1,000 gallons. And so what we find out is that the elderly fixed income customer will pay $10.48 per month. The average household will pay about $42 a month. The larger discretionary use household will pay about $125 a month, and the small business cafe will pay $356 per month. All right, our third option was the base charge for fixed costs and the volumetric charge for variable costs. As you recall, in this case, we were taking a look at the $52,000 that was variable every year and assigning it to the volumetric charge, and then the $290,000 that was fixed and assigning it to the base charge. And so this is going to be pretty similar in a lot of ways to the first example we looked at, a payment for access. But in this case, our widow will pay $55.67 per month. The average household will pay $60 roughly. The larger consuming household will pay about $73. And the cafe will pay $108. So a much, from the first two examples, the first one everybody paid exactly the same. The second one, there was a really wide variety between the prices. In this case, it's the lowest to highest band is pretty narrow. So the cafe, relatively speaking, is not paying, all that much more than the elderly fixed income person, considering they're using 34 times the amount of water. They're only paying about twice the amount of bill. And then finally, the last example, the $25 base charge and the volumetric charge for the rest. Our elderly customer will pay $31.37 a month for her 1,000 gallons. The typical family will pay about $50 for their 4,000. The larger home will pay about $100 a month for their 12,000, and the Main Street Cafe will pay about $240 for their 34,000 gallons. So here we can see the 4 rate structures and the 4 customers all laid out on one screen. And again, we've been sort of looking at this by row. So payment for access, everybody's the same. Payment for volume received, there's a huge difference. And then the others, the difference is a little bit narrower. But let's take a look at it in the columns. Like if you are on the governing board of Irvindale and you're looking at this, it may depend again on those rate setting philosophies that we talked about earlier. If you are a water system where affordability is a big concern, and I think affordability was the number 2 or the second highest chosen top priority for many of you, and I bet if we asked your number 2 priority, many of you said full cost recovery is number 1, would say affordability is number 2. This customer, this low-use customer, is probably the person that you have in mind when you think about affordability. So this customer could pay for 1,000 gallons a month as little as $10 and as much as $64 a month. That is a humongous difference for somebody who's on a fixed income. It's a humongous difference. So, you've got to think to yourself, okay, if we have a lot of these low-use customers, we want to understand what their bill is going to be, and maybe, that payment for volume of product received, if they're your biggest concern, that might be the best option, because then this low-use customer has complete control over his or her bill. They can choose to use a low amount of water and end up with a lower bill. Now, the 4,000 gallon a month user might still be a low-income household, and it may not necessarily be a low-income household. So, you may be concerned with that second column. And here, the discrepancy is not quite as big as it is for our elderly customer. But still, you're looking at a range anywhere from about $42 a month to $64 a month for this household. And, that $22 a month over the course of the year is not a ton of money, but for people who are just scraping by, counts. So that might be something to consider for them as well, if affordability for that customer is a big deal. For the discretionary water user, the $63.79 might be great for them. They might love that because, in fact, they might decide to discretionarily use even since they're not being charged per gallon consumed. So they would be a big winner under that rate structure. But again, here, the smallest to largest rate structure that we see differential is about 2. So their cheapest bill is $64. Their most expensive bill is $126 a month. It's basically twice what their cheapest bill is. For the 4,000 gallons, it's basically 1.5 is the differential. For the elderly customer, it's 6 times the difference. So again, these decisions that we make impact customers in a lot of very different ways. And then finally, for that Main Street Cafe, some of you may have worked in food service, maybe when you were younger, waiting tables or doing things like that, have family in the food service industry. You know that restaurants have very razor-thin margins. And so 34,000 gallons a month is a necessity for this business, but, they could pay as little as $64 a month for that. They could pay as much as $356 a month for that. So, if you really value in your community that elderly customer and protecting that customer first and foremost, you might find that payment for volume of product received the most attractive. If you want more of those cafes to come to your Main Street, you might look at a different rate structure because that one would be a little bit more expensive for that particular cafe. So again, these are just 4 rate structures and 4 customers, but this is the kind of process we want you to do within your water system as you're thinking about different billing options, is how are they going to impact different customers and where are we coming up with the numbers? Is there a logic to it? Is there, why are we doing it this particular way? Because I think for most of you, your bill, your rate that you set this year will not be significantly different from the rate you set last year, which would not be significantly different from the rate the year before. You may be adjusted up a little bit to cover the cost of inflation. Depending on the state, we see some states the bills change pretty often every year or two. Other states, they don't change very often at all. But, you have to keep going back in time and say, okay, somewhere somebody made a decision to set up our bill to look like this initially. What went into that decision? Well, if it's like this bottom row here, the $25 base charge and volumetric for the rest, because $25 sounded good, every year you're basing your rate assumption on something that maybe 40 years ago sounded good. So this is where we really encourage you, and we can help through our one-on-one assistance to dig through your costs and really be intentional about coming up with a rate structure that's going to work for you and a rate structure that is an understanding that the impact of that rate structure on your different types of customers. Okay, so a couple things we need to point out, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of tools that we have available for you. $344,445 is Irvindale's budget for the coming year. And the 450 customers and the 32.8 million gallons used are last year's actual numbers. So the question that I have to ask you is, these numbers are based on Irvindale's budget. Does that budget actually equal reality? Is Irvindale's expenses at the end of this fiscal year going to be $344,445? The answer is maybe, but probably not. It's important to remember that a budget is an authority to spend money. If you're a local government listening in today, you have a board that is voting on a budget, and that elected board is giving you, the staff, authority to spend money in a certain way. It is not necessarily reality. And so it's really important when you do these types of analyses to understand that some of the assumptions we make can change. If you were Irvindale and you switched to a base charge only with no volumetric charge, the amount of water used might skyrocket. It might go way above 32.8 million gallons annually, and you might end up with much higher costs than you were anticipating, because there's no incentive for conservation, there's no incentive to fix a leaky toilet, there's no incentive to not take 45-minute showers every day, there's no incentive to not just leave the tap running 24 hours a day, because you're not charging people based on the amount used. So your rate structure, again, it's going to send a signal to your customers about how you want them to use use water. And so we want to be really careful about that in terms of the assumptions. And you've got to be cognizant of the types of factors that could cause variation in your assumption. I just mentioned, rate changes. Typically, we find as your rates go up, usage goes down. The kind of term for that is price elasticity of demand. And so, as rates go up, usage is going to go down, not a one-for-one ratio, but it's going to go down a little bit. Your population might be changing. Customers might be moving in or moving out. That's going to cause some variation. If you're a small town and you lose or gain a big water customer, like if you're a small town, let's say a pulp and paper mill, and they disappear, that could be 50% of your water sales. That's going to have a big impact on these assumptions. The overall condition of the economy matters. When we had the economic downturn in the last 10 years, a lot of people started cutting back on water use because they might have been laid off or, were on a tighter budget. How well you're doing at collecting the bills every month is important. Weather obviously can have a big factor on your water use. So whether it be very rainy or very dry, if you have to put in any usage restrictions, especially if there's a drought going on, that can have a big impact. And then technology, as people install low-flow toilets or shower heads or buying new washing machines, they're likely to permanently use less water per capita in their household. So what we really recommend when we work with water systems on these issues is multiple forecasts based on different assumptions. You should be conservative. Don't forget about that idea of price elasticity. And in fact, the tools that we have assume that if your price is going up, that usage will go down a little bit. You should use available spreadsheet tools to test your projections. And, we often recommend giving your governing board, whether that be a local town council or an HOA board or whoever the final decision maker is, give that board some options so they can decide for themselves and think about those different types of customers as you're giving them those options. All right, so just as we're wrapping up here, I want to show you a couple of tools that are available. We have a spreadsheet tool on a water and wastewater rates analysis model, where you can put in your current rate structure and then put in some options and see how your finances will change as a result. So this is a good way to do multiple scenarios. And again, through our one-on-one help, we can help you with this tool. We also have a water utility revenue risk assessment tool. So this is where you're going to put in inputs on your rate structure and your customer use and weather patterns and some assumptions about price elasticity, and then the tool is going to show you the potential proportion of revenues that might be lost due to changes in water use patterns, weather, one-time significant or sudden conservation efforts. So this is another free tool we developed in collaboration with the Water Research Foundation. You can download from our website. This is what it would look like for your reference rates and comparison rates. So again, if you need some help with this tool, we're happy to walk you through it. And then the last tool to mention is available through the Alliance for Water Efficiency. It's a sales forecasting and rate model. This is available freely if you are a member of the Alliance. If you're not, I think you would either have to join to get a copy or pay for it, but it is a good tool that allows for multiple scenarios, so we wanted to mention it to you. And I think, the concluding thought in all of this, how to price water appropriately is, you've got to know that number you want to reach, and you've got to look at a lot of different scenarios, but I really encourage you to think about your customer base, think about how it's going to impact those different customers and how it's going to be different from your current rates, and then build from there and be really conservative in your assumptions that, greatly changing your rate structure may greatly change the usage pattern. So with that, I'm happy to take questions for the balance of our time. I believe Ben has got a couple of polling questions we'll do to close out. And if you have not already, please use that question box to submit your questions, and we'll be happy to answer as many as we can before the top of the hour.
All right, Glenn, we'll just jump right in. An attendee asked, have you encountered any communities whose volume charge is based on $ per gallon instead of $ per 1,000 gallons?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The answer is not per gallon, but I have seen in some parts of the country where they base it per 100 gallons instead of per 1,000 gallons. In one of the places where we see this is actually in a U.S. territory, the Virgin Islands, where some places the rate is as high, hold on to your seats for this one, is $8.50 per 100 gallons, so $85 per 1,000 gallons. But I think it's because the rate is very high there, so they're using a per 100 because that's really more the scale that people are doing. Per 1,000 gallons or per 100 CCF is really the more common, but I don't think I've ever seen a per gallon charge.
Thank you. And the next question is, what about using increasing block rates to promote conservation?
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. Obviously, I just gave 4 scenarios here, and I think in a future webinar, as part of this series, we're going to talk about how to price water for some of those other objectives. We were focusing a little bit more on the full cost recovery, but yes. So an increasing block rate structure that the more water people use, the higher the price gets, is intended to get at that discretionary water use. So if you're that 12,000 gallon a month customer that we talked about earlier that has the bright green lawn and swimming pool, an increasing block may give them a financial incentive to cut back a little bit on their usage. The only caution I would say is that if you have a lot of multi-generational families in your community, so maybe a household that has grandparents, parents, and kids living together, they may have a high monthly usage overall, but not really a high per capita usage. So that's the only caution we have with the increasing block rates. But yeah, and all the tools I mentioned, you can do increasing block or decreasing block rates, or different rates for residential versus commercial customers are all options. We kind of just did 4 simple ones today in the example, but those are certainly some options that are out there.
Thank you, Glenn. And the next question is, can you explain further on what you mean by fixed income? Aren't we all on a fixed income, and if we don't get paid based on commission?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, and sorry, I guess I tend to think of, when quote unquote the word fixed income is used, I think a lot of people are typically thinking of people who are on Social Security or retirement income or, on disability payments. But you're absolutely right. I mean, my salary is what it's going to be for the year. I think the difference for those low-use customers is that, if they're getting a Social Security payment today of, X dollars per month, 5 years from now, it's still going to be X dollars per month. Whereas for some of us in the working world, our salaries may go up. So, that fixed income phrase is really meant to be not just today a concern, but as rates go up over time, those customers' incomes are not going to go up by a commiserate amount.
Perfect. And another attendee asked, how would you bring in different size meters to the rates equations?
Yeah, really great question. And I think that this is something that we talk about in our workshops a little bit more, is that an option you have is that maybe your price per 1,000 gallons or 100 CCF is exactly the same for all of your customers, but you would change the base charge based on the size of the meter. So a residential customer may have a 5/8 inch or 3/4 inch meter. They would have a lower charge, and maybe an industrial customer might have a 10-inch meter. There's one example I'm thinking of off the top of my head. I don't have a slide for it in my deck, but I feel like their base charge for residential was maybe $6 a month, and for the 10-inch industrial size meters was $700 a month, but then their volumetric charge was exactly the same for everybody. So that's kind of a way that you could do it. You can bring base charge or meter size in as a proxy for overall water use and do it that way. So certainly that Main Street restaurant using 34,000 gallons is going to have a larger meter, I would suspect, than a household would. And that might be a way to get them to pay a little bit more of their fair share of the overall cost.
Thank you, Glenn. So we are receiving a ton of questions, so I just want to reiterate to the attendees that we will be following up with you offline via email to get the questions that haven't been answered. All right, we have time for a few more. So Glenn, how common is a base charge indexed by meter size?
Yeah, so the example that I just gave, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Again, we've done a lot of these surveys around various states, and we could, at least for the 14 or so states that we've done, pull some actual numbers. Off the top of my head, though, I would say, it's not super common, it's not uncommon, but it's probably as common as the other approach that you might be able to handle this, which would be to have a customer class of residents and a separate customer class for commercial. The one advantage of maybe doing it based on a meter size in that particular case is, if you're a Main Street cafe, you're going to use a lot of water. If you're a Main Street laundromat, you're going to use a lot of water. If you're a bookstore on Main Street, you're probably going to use less water than a typical household would use, and that's sometimes the disadvantage of having a commercial customer class versus residential. So it's not an uncommon way to do things, and if you have specific questions, follow up with us with a comment or email me directly. You see my contact info on there, and we can show you some examples of communities that have set up their rates in that way.
All right, and so I think this is a good question to end on, is how can we restructure our rates to achieve full cost recovery to avoid extreme sticker shock for our customers?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question to answer. I mean, the first thing, so let me tell you, maybe the way to answer this is to say a little bit about if we were to provide you with assistance, or I think, if you were to go with another technical assistance provider or rates consultant, typically what we're going to do is first take a look at your current rates. So, how are they structured? How much money are they bringing in? We would run some key financial indicators like your operating ratio, so the ratio of your revenue to expenses every year, your ability to pay off your debt service and see how far off maybe your current rates are. And then we'd do an affordability analysis, not just percent of median household income, but kind of dig into your, there's some great census data on, how many households make up to $10,000 a year in your community, or 10 to 20,000, 20 to 30,000, and so on. So we would take a look at the current snapshot, figure out where you would need to be, and I think, there's a couple things that might have to happen. One is that you might need to ramp the rate structure up over several years if we're talking about a really significant jump. I mean, we've worked with communities that have had to double their rates in a year, especially if they've lost a big customer. That's really, really hard for your remaining customers. So maybe ramp it up over a couple years is an option. How you communicate with your customers is going to be really key. Getting the buy-in from the board and the support of those top decision makers is going to be really key. So calculating the number is that's the easiest part, but actually selling it to the customers. And we have done some webinars about customer communication that are recorded and available on our website. That might be a good place to start. But again, if the person asking that question, if you're from a water system under 10,000 people served, would be happy to do some one-on-one help with you and see if we could figure out where your rates need to get to. But yeah, I don't want to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that this is an easy process. Running the numbers and sitting at a spreadsheet and crunching things is the easy part. Convincing the decision makers and your customers that this is what needs to be done is the hard part. And I will say that with Irvindale, that 344, 445 that we based on was from their budget, but when you looked at the budget, there was nothing for depreciation and there was nothing for capital expenses. So in reality, that budget number was probably lower than it needed to be. It was probably not reflective of full cost pricing. And so if we were to go back and work with that community, we might be looking at, instead of 350,000, needing, say, 450,000. So I think also understanding what that full cost amount needs to be is going to be an important part of the conversation as well.
Thank you, Glenn. So at this point, we have reached, our full hour of the session. Quickly before we wrap up, I do have two more quick polling questions. And the first one is if you would like to subscribe to the Environmental Finance Center blog. Again, if you want to sign up for the blog but don't have the opportunity to submit your answer today, you can sign up for the blog on our EFCnetwork.org website. And getting ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. The second polling question I have for you is if you are interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance for your small water system. If you are unsure about technical assistance or do not have the opportunity to subscribe your answer today, you can review the technical assistance form on our EFCnetwork.org website. And getting ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, in the chat box, there is a survey link coming out to you all. You will receive this in the follow-up email. But if you could just give us a few minutes to let us know how today's session went, we really do utilize these comments. And again, all of the questions that have been submitted that weren't answered will be answered offline via email. I want to thank Glenn for providing his expertise today on pricing water and rate structures. And I want to thank all the attendees who have joined us today. Glenn, I will throw it back to you for any additional closing comments.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate my thanks to all of you for taking some time out of your busy schedules to be with us. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we will follow up real soon with y'all. And just thank you, Savannah, for your logistical assistance as always. And we have a webinar, more webinars coming up, so please follow our EFC Network website. We'll have about 2 or 3 webinars a month for the calendar year. And hopefully we'll catch up with you again in the future. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And again, if we can be of any help, you've got our contact info. Please feel free to reach out at any time.